I was going on the Laura Coates show. So Laura Coates, beyond having this show, this radio show on Sirius, is also a legal analyst for CNN. And so I have to say, going with the theme of getting a fairer shake than one was expecting from mainstream media, my expectation, to be honest, when I was asked on, was that this was probably going to be like left punch in to shore up her centrist bona fides. But it really wasn't. It was just a very, it wasn't long. We're going to play it, but, it was a very straightforward, friendly interview. Just, queued me up, said nice things about the article. I actually think it's interesting that it was quite this friendly. I think that might say something, particularly because this happened so shortly after the World Central Kitchen bombing in Gaza, and so I think that I think this might be. I mean, I don't know enough about Laura Coates to be sure about this, in terms of her overall positions on this, but I think giving me quite this friendly an interview for this article might be an indication of just how badly Netanyahu has fucked up the PR war.
She's one of my best friends, and she said that you're right on the money about your analysis. we lunched after, and I said, "How did my boy Ben do?" And she said, "Well, normally I wouldn't have him on, but."
So say, since I guess the good thing in terms of people hearing this interview, bad thing for me, is that on the East Coast, this is like prime commute time. Right, the show goes from 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. East Coast, and so when they initially asked me on, I was like, okay, later you can get in that, the better, because that's between 4 and 6 in the morning for me in LA, and so they were going to give me the 5:45 LA time slot because that's the last one. And then there was like a congresswoman who was interviewed at the end. So they bumped me back to 5:30 Pacific time. And so whatever else is good or bad about this interview, I have to admit, I actually feel really proud just for being coherent, because like I had to set the alarm at 5 so I could like splash some water in my face and like go to the, go to the dining room table to, to set up and do the interview at 5:30.
Yeah, well, we'll play it. But if I was interviewed at 5:30 my time about international politics, definitely like my dreams would just be intermingled with like just things.
Yeah, I'd go back to bed and wake up and just be like, man, was I on the radio?
So yeah, all right. But yeah, we could check it out.
Hey, welcome back to the Laura Coates Show right here on Sirius XM POTUS. Joining us now is Ben Burgis, a Jacobin columnist and an adjunct philosophy professor at Rutgers University. He's the host of the YouTube show and podcast, Give Them an Argument, and the author of several books. Most recently, Christopher Hitchens, What He Got Right, How He Went Wrong, and Why He Still Matters. He joins me now. Ben Burgis, how are you?
I'm good, Laura. Thank you for having me.
I'm glad that you're joining us here today. Thank you for doing so. Listen, I read this recent piece that you wrote that's available online right now for everyone to see at jacobin.com. And you speak about it and here's the headline: Palestinians' right of return is a basic question of justice. You say denying Palestinian refugees the right to come back to the areas from which they were ethnically cleansed is deeply unjust, and we recognize the Palestinian right of return. Tell me a little bit more about about your argument here, and take a step back with us, if you will. This has been interesting for people to try to get up to speed on in the learning curve of the region, and since October 7th at the very least. So take a little bit of 1,000-foot perspective. Again, this is available on Jacobin.com, your article.
Yeah, thank you. So the issue of Palestinians' right to return has been a major issue in thinking about what would count as just resolution to the conflict for as long as there's been one. That when Israel was created in 1948, in that war, there were about 750,000 Palestinians who were kicked out of the country. When that happened, some people fled from atrocities that happened in that war, villages that were burned down by the Haganah, what became essentially the Israeli military. Also, some people who just fled, as civilians do in every war. That in every war, that there are civilians who flee to get out of the way while fighting is going on, in the full expectation that they should be allowed to return later. That of course, that everybody has a right to come back later if you flee from a war zone. But Israel has never let this happen, and this is particularly egregious because of the double standard that Israel has a law of return which says that any Jewish person anywhere in the world has an automatic right to make aliyah, in other words, to move to Israel from wherever they are, whether they're a refugee from anything, whether they've ever set foot in the Middle East before. But if you're a descendant of one of these people who was kicked out in 1948, or even if you literally are one of those people who's kicked out in 1948, then you're not allowed to come back. And the reason that that they're not allowed to come back is because the concern that, well, then there would be too many, that there would be too many Palestinians living in Israel proper, and so they wouldn't have the guarantee that there would always be a Jewish majority there. And the point I would really push is this something we think is a legitimate concern, that it's that we think ethnic majorities have a right to stay a majority forever. If somebody said it's very important that the United States permanently be a majority white country or a majority Christian country, and we can't let in too many of the wrong people because then that wouldn't happen. I think that most reasonable people would have a problem with that. They wouldn't think that this is a legitimate concern, and that's not even as bad if you're just using that as a consideration in immigration in general. While I would still find that racist and disturbing in that context, that's not nearly as bad as not readmitting people who were unjustly removed from the country in the first place.
Yeah, I couldn't do that at 5 a.m.
5:30 to be fair.
Okay.
Yeah. So we do have a part 2 to this.
When you look at this, and I appreciate you giving us that background, and how would this, and you've written about this in your latest piece, about how this might differ from a two-state deal and the symbolism behind it. What is the distinction for you?
Yeah, so I think that if there were a two-state deal, it's worth mentioning that right now it's very, very far from that being something that looks like it's on the cards happening anytime soon, even though the vast majority of countries in the world say they want it to happen. I mean, that's U.S. policy that we say we want it to happen. But certainly the current government of Israel under Benjamin Netanyahu says that that's never going to happen, that there's never going to be a Palestinian state, and it's certainly very hard right now to see how we get from here to there, right? But if there were a two-state deal, then very likely a full right of return would not be included in it. And in fact, in the past, various deals that have been offered certainly haven't included it. And in the past, Palestinian leaders have indicated that they would be willing to compromise on this for the sake of making a two-state deal happen. As far back as 2002, Yasser Arafat, who was then the leader of the Palestine Liberation Organization, said in an op-ed for the New York Times that, we'd be willing to accept that, this would be implemented in a way that would deal with Israel's demographic concerns, which is just a way of saying that if they would basically accept Israel doing a symbolic acknowledgement of the wrong that was done, Palestinians were kicked out in 1948 and maybe accepted a symbolic number of refugees to come back while not necessarily letting most of them back. There's something called the Arab Peace Initiative, which has been on the table for 22 years, where pretty much all of Israel's neighbors have signed up to this initiative that says that they would extend full diplomatic recognition to Israel in exchange for Israel withdrawing from the West Bank and Gaza and allowing a Palestinian state to be created there. And in that initiative, it says, well, it have to have a just solution to the refugee crisis. And you'll notice they don't say would have to let all the refugees back, because they don't think Israel would ever agree to that. So they just say a just solution, which again, I think means an acknowledgement of the wrong done and letting a symbolic number of Palestinians back. And look, I certainly understand why many Palestinians at this point, would be willing to take that deal if it were on the table. That for the last 57 years, since 1967, Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza have been subjects but not citizens of Israel. They can't vote their rulers out of office. If a Palestinian on the West Bank is accused of a crime, they are tried in a military court, not a real civilian court. They don't have any of the rights of citizenship, which of course Israeli settlers in the West Bank have. And that's the West Bank, which is not nearly as bad as Gaza, as I think everybody at this point knows. So I think people who've been living under those conditions for decade after decade after decade, I think understandably, great many of them might be willing to accept the loss of the right of return, real, not symbolic right of return, in exchange for a two-state deal that at least made them citizens of something. And I totally understand why. But I also think it's important to acknowledge that the basic justice of the original demand, that whether or not pragmatically this is something that ends up happening, this really is this great injustice that's been done to a lot of people, that, you say, no, even though any Jewish person anywhere in the world has a right legally right now to move to Israel, if you grew up in a refugee camp, your parents or grandparents were kicked out in an act of ethnic cleansing during the 1948 war, then you never ever have a right to come back. That, Rashida Tlaib is a U.S. Congresswoman, and she's Palestinian American. She's not even allowed to visit Israel. And I think that, whatever happens pragmatically, I think it is important to recognize the basic injustice of that.
This piece is really thorough, and I encourage everyone to read it in full as well. You go on to ultimately, discuss the idea of this being a question of universal human rights at its core, and whether ancestry should dictate that. You say that, of course, it does not, and human rights do not depend on ancestry. A really fascinating piece to give some broad perspective. Ben Burgis, thank you for joining us. You can look at this full article. It's available right now on Jacobin, JOCOBIN.com. The name of the piece, Palestinians' Right of Return is a Basic Question of Justice, written by our guest today, Ben Burgis, Burgis. Thank you for stopping by and broadening the horizon. I appreciate it.
You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.